Welcome. I'm Joe Head, Vice President of the Etowah Valley Historical Society, and we are here today at the Archer and Lovell Law Offices, and we have a special guest that we're going to interview, David Archer, and we're going to talk to him some about his background and his law practice and family, and then about Bartow County history. Welcome to our oral histories. I want to talk with you some today about your life and your knowledge of Bartow County history in particular. And you know, we're blessed to have a number of great local historians, Michael Garland, Guy Parmenter, and Sam Graham, among others, and some that we import in that do a great job for us. But you are renowned here.
No.
In, your history. Yes, you are. And we want to take some time and kind of pick your mind a little bit.
I think you call it infamous.
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 Well, we want to dig in and see. Let's begin a little bit with you're a native of Bartow County. Tell us something about where you were born and raised, as I say, raised up here in Bartow County, and your wife and your legal career.
Well, my daddy, S.L. Archer, was from Cartersville, and he married my mother, Martha Jane Berry, who was from Rome. They had a blind date, and they got married in Sam Jones Church on Christmas Day in 1935. And then they had four boys. I'm the youngest. At the time I was born, they had actually moved to Rome, and Daddy was working for the Rome Hardware. When he was here, he had been working for Jones Mercantile, which is across the street in that building where Taylor's Farm Supply was. They call it the Red Barn. And he worked there for several years. And then when I was born, you may not believe this, my mama told me this though, that she was pregnant with me for 11 months. 11 months.
Never on time.
Yeah, and I was the fourth, and she had, my oldest brother was 6 years older, next one was 5 years older, next one was 3 years older. So she had children right quick in succession, and so they put her on bed rest, and so she had to be in the bed for the most part of each day and night while she was pregnant with me. When I was born, they had to do a C-section. Daddy left work early. He had done everything they had told him to do, and he left early. So he had to stay up all night with Mama giving birth to me. He went back to work the next day, and his boss jumped on him and fussed at him because I told you to unload that freight car over there. Well, Daddy had stayed late and unloaded the freight car, but the guy jumped on him so bad it made Daddy mad. And so they moved back to Cartersville, and he went back to work at Jones Mercantile over there across the street. And then he worked at Lockheed all during World War II, having 4 children. He was not eligible for the draft, so he worked double shifts at Lockheed. In his spare time, he built a little house I grew up in on Lee Street. And when I say built, he built it himself.
Yeah.
And you couldn't buy
material,
lumber, you couldn't buy nails, any of that during World War II. So he would go around and tear down houses and knock the nails out.
Salvage.
Yeah, and then we would all sit and with hammers and straighten those nails out. That's how he built that house.
Recycle. My dad did the same thing into World War II, built our house on Etowah Drive.
Yeah.
Same year.
And so, I went all the way through the Cartersville school system, just like my brothers did. Miss Elliott, you may remember her.
Oh, I had her for English.
She used to call me, she'd call on me, she'd say, Sim Russell, daggone it, David. She could never get all of my brothers out of her head. And
so you had 3 names?
Yes. Yeah.
I remember Miss Elliott well, very much. Had her class. She was a spitfire.
Yeah.
Well, now, you married Ellen. Tell us about Ellen quickly.
Well, I was previously married for 16 years, and my first wife decided she liked somebody else better than she did me. So we got a divorce, and I swore I'd never get married again. And a couple of years later, I was at the courthouse for a calendar call, and this absolutely stunningly beautiful red-headed woman came walking in on the other side of the courtroom, and I looked at her and I just turned the circle. Who is that? So at the end of the court that day, I asked, she was with Judy Tibbetts Barnes, who was a probation officer, and Ellen was a probation officer. So I asked Judy about who is that new girl you got working with you? She said, that's Ellen Blankenship. I said, well, how old is she? She said, well, she's 21, about to turn 22. I said, oh, good Lord, I was 37 years old. I can't. And Judy said, yes, you can. Said, I promise you, y'all will like each
You'll
other.
click.
Yeah. So we dated, and a couple of years later we got married, and then all four of my children wound up coming to live with us. So Ellen was 15 years older. No, I'm 15 years older than Ellen, and she was about, I don't know, a few years older than my oldest daughter, so that was kind of weird. But she really helped raise those four kids, and then we had two of our own. So.
That's a good woman.
Mm-hmm. Yes, she is a good woman.
Well,
she's got a smart mouth on her, though.
Oh, does she?
Yeah.
Well, you probably deserve it. Tell us something just quickly about you got your education and then your legal training where?
Well, I started out at Mercer, went 1 year, did fairly well, not too good, but my daddy started having some financial problems, and my mother had the first open heart surgery in the southeastern United States.
Really?
In 1957.
In Atlanta?
Yep, at Emory, and they flew in a team of doctors from New York that did it, and they had to bring all the equipment in a separate airplane. There was so much of it, but it was very expensive, and they had no insurance. So at the end of my freshman year at Mercer, Daddy told me that I couldn't, he just couldn't afford for me to go back. So I went to Reinhardt, and I had a work scholarship where I worked 75 cents an hour, and it applied to my tuition room and board. And I worked in the athletic department. I umpired, I refereed, I drove a tractor and cut the fields and all that. But at the end of that quarter, now my older brother Andy had gone there, and he was Mr. Reinhardt. He was Mr. Everything. There's a Coach Collins, who was the dean of men, called me in and he says, you know, your brother's got a real good reputation here, and I hate to see you ruin it. He said, it might be better if you found somewhere else to go. So I didn't get kicked out, understand. I was asked to leave. There's a difference. And so it's kind of like throwing me in the briar patch, because I transferred to the University of Georgia.
But they would take you.
They did. They did. And so I went to Georgia, finished at Georgia. Well, I didn't exactly finish. I flunked out after 4 quarters. Had a bad quarter. I made all F's. Well, I did get 1 incomplete.
When you're talking to a former collegiate administrator.
I understand that. So they invited me to leave, put me on suspension. Mm-hmm. So I came home, worked for my daddy, delivering. He was in the wholesale business, and delivered, and I did that for a while, and then I went to work for the Georgia Department of Transportation, and I had my own personal shovel, and I shoveled, and I did whatever road crews did. And then I got a job at Lockheed, and I was $75 a week.
Big money.
I had been making $48 a week, so a big jump. And I started back to night school.
Where?
At what we call Banbury University, but it didn't exist. It was on an old campus for some high school that was called Banbury, but it was a University of Georgia extension.
Okay.
And you could get 2 years of credit there only. So I went as long as got all the credit I could. During that period of time, got married, started having children. When I got all the credit that I could get at Banbury University, I went to Athens to see if I could find a job. And I had been in a fraternity, and it so happened the day I went in to interview for a job at the clothing store, Dick Ferguson's clothing store. It was on Broad Street in Athens. One of my old fraternity brothers came in. "Archer, how you doing?" You know, and hugged me and everything, and that impressed the manager, and so he gave me a job. And so we moved to Athens, lived in the married housing, the old army barracks that they used to have there, and I worked there at Dick Ferguson's till I graduated. I wound up going full time and finishing in night school, and then I applied to University of Georgia Law School, and I went. I'd been accepted. I went for an interview, and they had a brand new dean. Happened to be Velma Tilley's father was the dean. He had come from Case Western University, and he had instituted some new rules. And one of those rules was that you couldn't work more than 10 hours a week and go to the University of Georgia Law School. I didn't know that. So I'm sitting there, I've got my class schedule, and the dean asked me, "Do you have any questions about your schedule?" And I said, "Well, is there any way I can move that afternoon class to a morning class? I noticed that it's available." He said, "Why would you want to do that?" I said, "Well, I work part-time down at Dick Ferguson's clothing store," as did two other people who were going to the law school. And he said, "Well, part-time, how many hours a week?" I said, 35 hours a week. He got me. So I couldn't go to the University of Georgia. I mean, I never even stepped in the classroom, but I got kicked out before I started. So I, you know, yeah. So the last night class I had, there was a guy that taught that class who worked at Westinghouse Electric at their manufacturing plant there in Athens where they made transformers. And he sought me out and offered me a job in the purchasing department. Mm-hmm. So for a year, we stayed in Athens. I worked for Westinghouse as a purchasing agent. I bought all kind of stuff from manufacturers that was incorporated into the manufacture of transformers. And so along about the end of that year, my boss called me in and he says, "Archer, you're getting a promotion, and we're going to move you up in the purchasing department, but you have to move to Sharon, Pennsylvania, which is our home office." And I said, "I ain't moving to Sharon, Pennsylvania." And so I started trying to figure out what I was going to do, and I put in an application to go to Emory University Law School that had a night program. And so I got accepted. I called an old friend at Lockheed who worked in human resources department, and he got me a job. And so I went back to work at Lockheed, this time with a coat and tie, mm-hmm. you know. But I was working in the engineering department as an administrator. And what's funny is when I walked in that building, it was what they call the B-95 building, huge building. It's about 25,000 people worked in it. And they walked me to my supervisor and introduced me to him. And the very next desk to my supervisor was Sonny Miller, that I'd grown up with and ran with all my life. And so I went to work in the same department that Sonny Miller was in.
So when did you finish your law degree?
1970, and I graduated number 3 in my class. But there wasn't but 3 people in my class.
Yeah, cute. So when you finished law school, did you come immediately to work here in Cartersville? Set up a practice or join someone?
Not exactly. I was working. I'd gotten a job at the trust company bank, trust department. That became SunTrust and now Truist. And I left Lockheed because I couldn't get tuition reimbursement. I went to the trust company, and after the 4th interview that I had, they hired me. The guy, I interviewed the same guy 4 times, and the 4th time I think he remembered me. And he said, hadn't I interviewed you before? And I said, 3 times. He said, and you keep coming back? Why do you do that? And I said, because I want to go to work for this bank. And he gave me a job. So I went to the trust department. They had tuition reimbursement based on what my grades were. They would pay a percentage of my tuition in books, and it was a good deal.
Yeah.
When I graduated, back then you couldn't take the bar before you graduated. You had to wait till you graduated to take the bar. So I took the bar, and I was still there at the trust company in Georgia, and I sent out letters to every lawyer that I thought might be interested in hiring somebody in Cartersville, Georgia. I didn't get a response from anybody. So I came up here and went to a couple of law offices, and I basically was told this: we've got 26 lawyers here now, and we ain't got room for another one. There's just not enough business.
In the city?
Yeah, in Bartow County.
In Bartow County.
So we got 26 lawyers. Now we got 100 and something. But so I called Lamar Hill, was president of First National Bank, and they had made me some loans all the way through law school. It was not a student loan program. It's just the bank made me loans that I didn't have to pay back till after I graduated. And I told him, I said, I've graduated. Y'all need to send me a payment book. Let me start paying you back. He says, what are you going to do? I said, well, I don't know. I'm here at the bank, but I can't seem to get a job as a lawyer. He said, I thought you were going to come back to Cartersville. And I said, well, I thought I was too, but apparently Cartersville doesn't want me to come back. He said, I want to give you a name and a number, and I want you to wait 30 minutes, and I want you to call this Don Gettle, law firm in Atlanta, Gettle, Jones, and Fraser. Here's the number. You wait 30 minutes. I waited 30 minutes. I called Don Gettle. He said, yeah, I just talked to Lamar Hill, and he told me to hire you.
That's some clout.
Yeah, they had Don Gettle taught at Atlanta Law School, and Lamar Hill had actually attended Atlanta Law School, and Don and Lamar became friends, and Gettle's law firm had taken over the representation of First National Bank. So they hired me and sent me to Cartersville to open a branch office, and I did. And up here by myself. I'd go to Atlanta a day or two a week. But that's how I got back to Cartersville.
Well, quickly, where was your office that you opened? What was the address? Or?
I'm trying to think.
The building still there?
Now? You know where Harry Daniel Insurance is?
Yes.
And there's a small building on
right?
the corner. If you're facing Harry Daniels, on the left corner, there's a small office building there, and it's like Ajax something in there now. And Gettle had rented that office, and so I went into that office. That was my first law office. And then, and I'll tell you, when Lamar Hill was no longer, I'll leave all that out, but when he was no longer president of First National Bank, Gettle decided he would close this office. And he wanted me to come back to Atlanta, drive to Atlanta every day. And I said, I think I'll stay here. And so I stayed. I had packed up every legal file I had and taken it to the bank when Lamar left the bank. And it's been 6-8 months maybe. And the new president of the bank at that time was Bill Shadden. And Bill called me and told me to come back up there and get that box. And so I continued representing First National Bank.
So you, by default, went to work for First National Bank?
I didn't go to work for them, but they were my major client.
They were a client, I see. Okay. And since then, I think you're really well known here as the counsel for the city.
I ran for city council as the 3rd Ward alderman. I'm trying to remember, and they called them aldermen back then. I think I took office in January of '72, and then I ran for, it had 2-year terms. I ran for election in '74, and I did not run again at the end of '75. So I came off the city council the then city attorney had resigned to run for Superior Court judge, and so Walter Mahone was the city manager, and John Dent was the mayor, and John Dent called me and wanted to talk to me about being city attorney. So I think it was about October of '76 I became the city attorney, and have been ever since. 45 years, I think, something like that.
Well, we might come back to some of this, but I think I want to fast forward and get into some history of Bartow County, because you are one of our favorite go-to people here in Cartersville and Bartow County about Bartow history, and you are a wealth of knowledge of that. And so I've got a number of topics, and I thought we just might go through these, and you might spin off on some stories or whatever.
Is this kind of a pop quiz?
It is. It is. I hope you don't flunk, but
I probably will. I flunked out of 2 or 3 colleges.
Well, maybe not. But I've got this broken up into sort of 2 categories. So just run with me on this. I think obviously when we talk about Bartow County history, we have to pay some homage and due respect to Lucy Cunyass.
Oh yeah.
And the author of the Bartow history, and so a lot of people use that as the Bible. You know, we go back to that and do a quick check.
You know, she wrote that in what 32, 33 for the centennial of Bartow County, and then she republished it in I think '76, and I'm in that book because she listed the lawyers that were practicing, and that's the only that's my claim of fame. And I went when she actually signed. I have an autographed copy of that
from her. But to be included in that book by her, second edition anyway.
Well, just because I was a lawyer, it didn't have anything to do with the history.
But still, that's history.
I'm in the book.
Okay. Well, some of these may take you by surprise, but I'm gonna start down my list, and whatever comes to mind or a story, you just jump in. Why was Bartow County referred to as the Empire County?
Mining. Mining started here in the early 1830s, even before the Cherokees were removed in 1838. And by the way, one of my great whatever grandparents, they moved here in 1832 in Cassville, and opened the first trading post. Really? And he was George Bell Russell, and he was the ordinary of Cass County until he died untimely death in 1847.
Where was the trading post?
Right downtown in Cassville. It would have been burned up with everything else. And then he went in and he had a hardware store or a mercantile store with somebody else. I don't remember who that was, but he's buried in a Cassville cemetery.
Well, we can't talk about Bartow unless we talk about the Native Americans. And we've done a good bit of that recently, but the Mississippian mound builders, and do you have any comments about them and the DeSoto and DeLuna expedition through here? A lot of people don't know that. You know,
I worked on the excavation crew with under Lewis Larson, and I'm trying to remember, I think it might have been between graduating it was after my freshman year maybe. Anyway, somewhere along in there, and I worked there one summer. I do remember that the first day I had 32 blisters on these hands because it was hard work, very hard work, and that had something to do with me getting real interested in the Native American history. And Lewis Larson and I became the head archaeologist and later the state archaeologist. He was a friend of my family. He used to come eat Sunday dinner with us every Sunday, and I had a lifelong friendship. He died here, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and to the extent that I'm the executive of his estate, that was how close our friendship was. And so, through the years, talking to Lewis, Lewis got me appointed to the, I don't remember what you call it, but there's a state committee that reviews national registration, national historic designations, applications.
Oh, yes.
And you have to, the state committee reviews those, and if you reject them, they're over, but if you accept them, you send them on to the federal government, and then they review them again. He got me on, I served on that 4 years. Lewis was on that, and he's why I was on it. So the reason I'm telling you about Lewis is he was somebody, he was my go-to guy about anything when I would do research throughout the years on Native Americans. And one of the first things I did when I really got interested in it is, I think I showed you one time, I took a map and I started collecting all of the written archaeological reports that I could find. And I started charting on that map where mounds either are or had been. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if I ever showed you that or not. I know I told you about it. I think I lost it when our house flooded, but in 2009. But I had charted 28. I think you have since found maybe a couple more.
Up to 30. Yeah,
but Lewis, I consulted with Lewis about that, and he directed me and where I could find archaeological reports. And I've got a banker's box over there, 2 of them, full of archaeological reports that have been done prior to some development in Bartow County, and that I pursued that, and then I got real interested in the history of the Cherokee, and in particular Chulio. Now, Chulio is one interesting character. I think he died around 1825. But if you do Google research in the name Chulio, you're not going to find much. You're going to find Chulio Road. You're going to find Chulio Medical Center. So the trick is you got to know what his other name was. Shoe Boots. Shoe Boots. And the reason they call him Shoe Boots is he wore some boots that went up to his knees. And he also wore a red jacket that was some kind of a military jacket. And he fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and he was a fierce warrior. Mm-hmm. There are books written about Shoe Boots, but just research Shoe Boots. Right. That's where you find him.
He was a bold character. I think he even went up to Kentucky to get one of his wives.
Well, what he did, he went to Kentucky with, I think it was the Shawnee Indians. He had been banished from this area because he killed somebody. He thought he was justified, but I don't know the circumstances of that. But he went up there and they raided a settlement in Kentucky, and they captured some children. And one of those children was a 13-year-old named Clarissa. And he brought Clarissa back to Georgia with him. He had a slave that I can't remember what her name was, but he had children by her, and he married his slave. And he had children by her, but when she died, he married Clarissa, the 13-year-old. She was older by then. Mm-hmm. And of course, the folks in Kentucky, her family, have been looking for her and looking for her and looking for her. And by word of mouth, they heard something. They came here, and he wouldn't let her go. But he would let her go, but without the children. And they'd had 2 or 3 children, and she wouldn't leave without the children. So sometime later, she sneaked off with children, and went back to Kentucky, and was ostracized. She was not treated well
in Kentucky. But
she remarried. And there is a Supreme Court of the United States case where her children by Chulio petitioned to be included as head rights in the Cherokee Nation, and they were declined. And so there was an appeal process, and that went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. I can't remember the name of the case, but I've got a copy of it. After they were grown, and eventually they were admitted into the Cherokee Nation.
That's a very obscure story. A lot of people don't know about that. And for those that might be watching, Chulio Road is really the Harley Road today.
Well,
It's up
in Floyd County, it's still Chulio. When I was growing up, to the extent that I did, it was Chulio Road from Cartersville to Rome.
And me too.
And somebody changed it. They shouldn't have done that.
They shouldn't have. Now, one other thing before we leave him, was he a chief or not?
He was what you call a sub-chief.
Okay.
And one more thing about Chulio, he was an interesting character. He went to Kentucky and tried to get Clarissa to come back, but she wouldn't do it. But you know, the Moravians had missionaries, and they had one at Spring Place up in Murray County. And the Moravians were closely affiliated with Joseph Van, who owned the house there that's now it's a state park, the two-story brick house. It's been restored, and the state maintains it. And across the street was where the mission was. We also had one here, but that wasn't Moravian. Well, Ellen and I went to Old Salem, in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and there's this great old village there that they've maintained since the 1700s. That was a Moravian village, and they have a great museum there. And the Moravians they kept detailed journals, and they did it in German because they were German. And so the people at the museum have started translating the journals. And I bought 3 volumes of translations from German to English of the Moravians. Chulio is mentioned in there several times. And they mention him by the name Chulio. And he was instrumental with getting Cherokee children to attend the mission school at Spring Place. Now they quit. They may have another volume now, but I was looking for 1830s stuff, and they hadn't gotten that far. They stopped somewhere in the 1820s. But what I've got is it's interesting. It just doesn't have a lot about what happened here.
Right, but there's some documentation to validate.
Oh, yeah.
Well, just quickly, before we leave that, do you want to make any comment about, because people don't realize that DeSoto and DeLuna came through here.
You know, what I know about that is that in 1980-something, the University of Georgia, and I've forgotten the guy who headed it up, came here and did some archaeological studies right along in there where the leak mound is. But they did more than just where the leak site is, which is, you know, for people that don't know, is out West Avenue, right after you cross the Etowah River.
Beyond lands.
Yeah, and they found a sword, parts of a sword during, I think around 84, 83, somewhere along in there, that was attributed to the DeSoto expedition.
Right.
And some of the journals that were written talk about them coming to a place called Itaba, and people that know more than I do think that is Etowah.
Right. In translation, they phonetically tried to spell it.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let me do a quick jump now to another topic. Any comment about prior to the Civil War, when the debate was going on about secession and so forth? People are surprised to learn that Cass voted how?
Well, they voted against secession, and there were three delegates that were elected, and they went. I guess it was in Milledgeville then, because Milledgeville was the capital. And I don't remember the names. I should, but I don't. But it doesn't matter. They went and they voted against secession. But then, when the overwhelming majority voted for it, they supported it.
That's right. They did. And then, in that period or just before, people would probably be shocked to learn that the first state Supreme Court cases were held where and by whom?
In Cassville. You know, Cassville was the largest city north of the Chattahoochee River until you get to Chattanooga. And, you know, had 2 colleges, had a brick 2-story courthouse, had a hotel, had several mercantile stores, blacksmiths and cobblers, and I mean it was a thriving community. And in 1846, I think it was, they divided between the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. And so when the Supreme Court was created, they came to Cassville and held the first Supreme Court session for Georgia at Cassville. And I think, Warren Aiken Sr. probably had a lot to do with that because, he started his law office in the 1830s. It's the oldest continuing family-owned law firm in the state of Georgia.
Even today?
Yeah, even today, because it's gone. Morgan is the great-grandson of Warren Aiken Sr. So
right.
I'm sure Warren Aiken Sr. had a lot to do with it coming here.
I agree.
But you had 20-something lawyers in Cassville, and one of the reasons there were so many lawyers is that when the treaty was negotiated between the United States government and the Cherokee Nation in 1835, that treaty provided for a sum of money to be paid to the Cherokees, but the individual Cherokees were entitled to compensation for the improvements on the property where they lived or where they farmed. And that their inventories, that inventory peach trees, apple trees, hog pens, log cabins,
roads,
and so they had put in a claim, and so this throng of lawyers descended upon Cassville, representing Cherokee
interests,
natives, and trying to get the most money for them that they could.
And of course, they got a fee for that.
Yeah, well, lawyers always do.
Well, let's pivot again. Colonel Thomas Spencer used to write a great deal in the papers, and I read a lot of his work.
I have too.
And what I found interesting, which will segue to the question, he says there were 36 engagements, battles, if you will, that were fought just in Bartow County. And a lot of people are really unaware of that conflict and the impact it had on this county, and they just know that Cartersville or Castle was burned. But there was a good bit of conflict here. What was the first battle fought at that time? I guess Bartow County.
You wouldn't call it a battle, but the great locomotive chase
is the first event.
The first event that brought us into it.
But I'm talking about the conflict that would be up around Adairsville.
Well, when Sherman took over the Union forces in Chattanooga in 1863, his intent all along was to come across the state line, and in early 1860, well, April of 1864, he came. They had a big battle at Resaca, and he flanked the Confederate forces, went through Snake Cove or something. I forgot what it was, Rattlesnake Cove or something like that. And they flanked and came around, and so Johnson, who was the Confederate commander, withdrew. And he withdrew all the way to Cassville, and he entrenched in Cassville. But he had a rear guard that was a pretty substantial number of men who were trying to hold the Union forces back, and they fought an engagement at Adairsville. I've seen it referred to as the Battle of Adairsville. I think that's probably overstating it. It was a rear guard action, and it was at a place called the Octagon House. There's a great book written by a Confederate private, Sam Watkins, who was a part of that rear guard action. His book came out shortly after the Civil War, and he's still in print. It's a great book, day-to-day stuff. And he described the battle at the Octagon House. There was a Saxon family that owned the Octagon House. It was a brick 2-story house, and it was shaped octagon.
Just like a stop sign.
Yeah, yeah. And so the Confederates piled furniture up in the Unions. By the way, Douglas MacArthur's grandfather was one of the Union soldiers that fought in that battle.
Correct.
And you read what Sam Watkins wrote about it, and they piled up dead Confederates inside the house, and it was just carnage. It was bad. And then some of them were able to escape, and then go from Adairsville and get in formation at Cassville.
Right, right. Well, I thought that was an interesting tidbit about MacArthur being at the Octagon House. Yeah. That really is. Can you tell us something about the Civil War period and the bushwhackers that were here in North Georgia and the Union spy sympathizers? Any comments about those?
Yeah, and I've done a good bit of research on that. Bushwhackers were groups of probably deserters from both the Union and Confederate armies. And in Bartow County, you had a lot of Union sympathizers who were concerned about letting it be known that they were Union sympathizers. And so you had guerrilla groups, some people would call them, but bushwhackers is what history has labeled these groups. But you had competing Union bushwhackers and Confederate bushwhackers. Now the bushwhackers were a bunch of thugs. I mean, they would descend on a home where if there was a Union sympathizer, if there's any reason to believe somebody in that family was a Union sympathizer, they would just go in and hang them, shoot them.
Brutal.
Yeah, and one of the worst ones was a guy named John Gatewood. And John Gatewood came out of Texas. There's a book on him, I've got it over there, that details all the atrocities that he did. There was another one named Jack Colquitt, who was a Confederate bushwhacker. And they roamed up and down, and if you've ever seen the movie Coal Mountain,
mm-hmm.
and you have the Home Guard,
yes.
the atrocities that the Home Guard did, it's similar to what the bushwhackers did in this area. And there were families that fell out even after the war. There were killings and
feuds
between people that were Union or Confederates. And interestingly, there's something called the Southern Claims Commission that was created in 1872, I think, by the federal government. And the purpose of that commission was for Southerners who could prove that they were loyal to the Union. They could make claims that would be considered by the Southern Claims Commission for compensation. And they would write a narrative under oath, and they would get witnesses who would, under oath, verify what they said. And I wish I could remember the exact number. I've counted how many were in Bartow County. It was over 100, but only 20 or 30 were approved. But it's incredible to me how many people were willing, after the war was over, 6, 7 years later, to go under oath and say, I was loyal to the Union from the get-go. Now, if you were ever a public official under state, local, or a Confederate government, you were ineligible. You just couldn't, So there were some people, very few in Bartow County, that actually got compensation. But these narratives, you read them, and by the way, you can find that on Ancestry.com. You just go on Ancestry.com, type in Southern Claims Commission, and boom, you can go to what state and what county, and you go to Bartow County and see the name of every person who filed a claim swearing that they were loyal to the Union.
Amazing. I know that was the case with Uriah Stevens with the Great Locomotive Chase in Kingston, which you may or may not know. He was one who filed a claim that was denied because they discovered he had become the Confederate postmaster.
Yeah, I think I copied all of them from Bartow County, and I tried to find those, but 2 stacks of boxes over there, and it'd take me 2 days to go
To
through
go
them.
get
So I
through
just
it.
said I wouldn't do that.
Well, moving on a little bit before we get finished with the Civil War, a couple of things here. I think people would find it interesting for your comments on Camp Foster and the Bridge Guard. How did that come about? What was it about?
Well, the governor of Georgia, Brown, had a falling out with the Confederate government from the
Jefferson
beginning all the way through the Civil War. And so he created his own militia, I guess you'd call it, but their allegiance was not to the federal government. Their allegiance was to the state of Georgia.
To the Confederate government.
Yes. And they primarily used them as guards at bridges, like the Etowah River Bridge. And Camp Foster was a camp that was somewhere down in that area. I don't know if anybody knows exactly where it was, but it was in that area where the river bridge is, probably over there where Chemical Products has got property, somewhere in that area. And they also did training for some cavalry training there.
Right.
But I know you've looked for it, and I've looked for it. I can't find anything.
No, I've tried to benefit from what you knew, but all we can know is it's down there, and we can make a case for it
Somewhere.
That's about it. Well, I think there's another story that's fun for you to tell. I've heard you tell it, but I'll just kind of approach it this way. Who was General Custer's roommate, and who ate his breakfast?
Pierce Manning Young was, in 1861, was a senior at West Point, and his roommate was Custer. And they were friends, best friends.
And Young was from here.
Yeah. And so in 1861, Pierce Manning Butler resigned from West Point and came back, and I think to begin with was a colonel, and then later was appointed a general, and I think he was the youngest general in the Confederate Army, but he was in the Army of Virginia, and there was an event where the Confederate troops were attacking a house, a southern family home, but the Union troops had occupied it, and in that home that morning, General Custer was eating his breakfast, and so one of the sentries came running in and said the Confederates had broken through the lines and they'll be here at the house any minute. So Custer got up from the breakfast table and told the matron of the house to tell her. He knew that Young was his opponent, and he said, well, tell General Young that he's welcome to finish my breakfast. So General Young comes in, sits down, and finishes the breakfast. And so battling, skirmishing all day long, and they're eating back then they called it supper. And they're eating supper. Confederate sentry comes running in and he says, Yanks will be here any minute. They're broken through the lines. So General Young got up and told the matron of the house, tell General Custer he's welcome to finish my supper. And so Custer sat down and finished his supper.
That's a great story,
Yeah.
particularly because it's connected here to Bartow, and people would not know that they were roommates either at West Point,
Yeah.
Young and Custer. We got a lot of ground to cover. I want to know, do you have any comments that you might want to make about any of the vintage or classic homes that were here from the Civil War period even through today? I think of the Cliffs and Valley View and the Stiles home, and any particular properties you want to mention.
In Cartersville, on Gilmer Street, there's the Wofford House, 2-story white house that was in the family of General William Wofford, who was a general in the Confederate Army and fought at Gettysburg and came and surrendered the last, I think, 7,000 Confederate troops descended on Kingston, Georgia, and they surrendered. His home, that's an important home. Roselawn, probably at the time of the Civil War, was a one-story house.
Mm-hmm.
It was later jacked up in what is now the second story was the first story, but that's an antebellum home. Then you kind of gotta get out in the county. I mean, there's not. There used to be some more. I've read about one that was on Tennessee Street, but I can't place it. I don't remember ever seeing it. There was one located where my old law office is on South Tennessee Street that was a home that burned in 1900, but it was an antebellum home. And then you go to Valley View out Chulio Road.
Mm-hmm. And there's Melbourne out there, but it's not.
Yeah,
Civil War
that
period.
was built right after the Civil
Mm-hmm.
War. And then P.M.B. Young's home where he lived, his daddy built it in the 1830s, and then there's and of course that's at the right out. What's the name of that street? What's the name of that road? Pine Grove Road.
Mm-hmm.
End of Pine Grove Road. Beautiful, beautiful home. Still in the same family, incredibly. And then the Tumlin home out at the end of Etowah Drive, that was there. That was an antebellum home, and there's some in Kingston, where Sherman's office, where he used when he stayed in Kingston 2 weeks after the fall of Atlanta before he went to Savannah. That house is still standing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's several others, but we're fortunate.
We are. We still have some left, but those are worth mentioning. And just parallel to that, any quick comments on some of our iconic businesses, manufacturing, mining, agriculture, the genetics, any particular businesses?
Well, if you look back at the mining industry that was in Bartow County, I mean, there were dozens and dozens of companies that mined different things. Bauxite was heavily mined by 2 or 3 different companies.
Iron ore.
Barite, gold. We had a gold mine here. Yeah, and uranium. Uranium has been found here.
Right.
I mean, what do you make aluminum out of? Whatever you make aluminum out of, that was mined here, and it was all over the county.
Ochre.
But basically, I-75 kind of is the western boundary of what geologists describe as like a train wreck.
Convergence.
Because you've got all these different minerals that have been mined for years, for over 100 years. And now the only mining is people don't like it, but rock quarries. We got 3 or 4 of those, and we got New Riverside Ochre, and that's it.
Right, that
That's
remains.
It. Yeah.
Well, when I did some research and to connect with this about our mining history, I was wanting to get a handle on how many mining companies have actually operated here.
Oh God.
And it took me, and I'm not sure I got them all, but it took me about 4 or 5 months. But 140 corporations have mined here. So mining was, back to the Empire County,
Yeah.
it was the driver.
Yeah. And let me say this. You know, the mining has stopped. You take Pagamine Road, there's a 1,100 acre tract there where they mined barite there for over 100 years. And there's some still there. But what's happened is that other countries are producing these products more cheaply than they can be mined in this country. The company that owned the mine there at Pagamine, they had that processing plant on Highway 41 up on the hill there, right when you go across the river.
Peruvian?
No, that was way back.
Okay.
The Peruvian went out of business.
Thompson Wyman?
Yeah, well, them too, but what's the name of that company? I can't think of the name of the company. It doesn't make any difference. But they were mining barite and processing it in that plant there, right as you go across the Etowah River on 41 South. when they quit mining barite, they shut it down, and they were having barite shipped from China to New Orleans, put on trucks, and deliver it to this processing plant. They call it's Cypress now, is the company.
Yes.
Yeah, and they were processing barite from China instead of digging it out of the ground in Bartow County.
To bring it here cheaper to process it.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And the main product they were making was a mud type substance thing that they pump in oil wells to lubricate the drill. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things. There's a lot of products they make out of that, but that's what that company was doing.
Well, before we leave this topic, any comment on the Georgia Genetics Institute or carpet industry, either one of those?
I remember when it was still operating, and we're talking about on Highway 20 mm-hmm. before you get to Georgia Highlands College on the left, going toward Canton. There's a building there that was built, I want to say in the 30s, and it was local people donated money to operate that. And there was a guy named Alphabet Collins. Mm-hmm. And the reason is he had 3 or 4 initials in his name, so they just called him Alphabet. And Alphabet Collins ran that place, and they experimented with certain types of resistant cotton that would resist boll weevils and diseases, and they in their operation they increased the production of cotton tenfold. I mean, they were able to produce strands of cotton that greatly increased the amount that was produced out of
per acre.
Yeah, and then I don't know, it shut down maybe in the 60s or 70s, and because of the charter that created that thing, they didn't know what to do with the property, so they donated the property to the Board of Regents, mm-hmm. the Board of Regents of the state. And then, fast forward 20, 30 years, Bartow County and the city of Cartersville trying to raise some money to buy part of that property back to build Georgia Highlands College. So we had to buy back what we gave them in the first place.
Exactly, exactly. Well, I'm down to my last third of questions. I want to do a round robin, fast.
Another pop quiz.
It's a pop quiz. I'm going to throw out some names and just topics.
All right.
You tell us what comes to your mind, but we're going to run through these.
Do I win a prize?
Well, Judy's going to have to provide that. Amos Ackerman.
Amos Ackerman. Ackerman. Amos Ackerman was from somewhere in New England. He married a Southern girl before the Civil War. He came south. He lived in Elberton, Georgia, and he served in the Confederate Army as a quartermaster. He was a lawyer after the. Let me say, I got to say this. After the War of Northern Aggression, he was appointed to be the U.S. Attorney for the District of Georgia. I think it might have been North Georgia. Yeah, it was North Georgia. And then when Ulysses Grant was elected president, he was trying to unify the North and the South, and one of the things he wanted was to appoint a Southerner as the Attorney General of the United States. So he appointed Amos Ackerman as Attorney General of the United States. And he was Attorney General and helped draft the Civil Rights Act of 1871, which is still on the books, and all the civil rights lawsuits you read about are based on that statute. The first case that was filed criminally against the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina for treatment of former slaves, Amos Ackerman personally prosecuted that in court, and he created 2 agencies, or 2 groups that became agencies to assist him in doing that. One is the Department of Justice now, and the other one is the FBI.
Right, that's impressive.
Yeah. And now Grant asked him to resign, and the reason he did is that he wrote an opinion about the Transcontinental Railroad, where they were going to hook up by rail the west and the east. And there was legislation went through Congress that gave these two competing railroads an enormous amount of mileage on either side of the track. Typically, this track out here was built originally in the 1830s. Mm-hmm. You have 33 feet on each side of the center of the track, 66 feet, and that's typical all over the country. But Congress, to induce these railroad companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad, gave all this additional property. So Amos Ackerman said, whoa, that is in violation of the Constitution gratuity clause. You're giving them something. They're not earning it, you're giving it to them. And he wrote an opinion and sent it to the president, and it got published. So all these railroad barons descended upon Grant and said, you got to get rid of that guy. He's in our pocketbook now. And so Grant asked him to resign. He resigned. He originally moved back to Elberton. And when he got back to Elberton, he had become a Republican. And he was active in getting former slaves to run for public office. And he was speaking on their behalf. He was trying to get them elected. Mm-hmm. And they almost got run out on a rail. And he was a close friend of Warren Aiken Sr. And Warren Aiken Sr. suggested that he move here. And so he moved here and he bought that property where my office used to be. And there was already a house there. I can't remember the guy's name that owned that house. But he was the guy that owned that house had died. He was the first head of the Freedmen's Bureau. Oh. First head of the I can't remember his name. Anyway, the Freedmen's Bureau was created to assist former slaves and to protect them from persecution and to prosecute people that mistreated them. Right. And he was the head of it. Well, he died. Amos Ackerman bought that property, which consisted of many more acres than what's there now. And he died in, I think, 1890. He had a law office down on that flat part on South Tennessee Street of that property, and was active in the law practice till he died.
Right. And you still own that property today?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to pick up some speed. Next one, Sam Jones.
Interesting. I'm going to give you a tie-in between Amos Ackerman and Sam Jones. Sam Jones, of course, was the Billy Graham of his day. Right. He was nationally renowned as an evangelist, a pulpit-beating evangelist, and he was bad to offend people. But the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville was built by someone that a ship captain that he converted during one of his church services. Revivals. Yeah, and so that Captain Ryman built that for Sam Jones to come and hold services. Well, back in Cartersville, Sam Jones preached a sermon, and Amos Ackerman had a son named Walter. Walter was a postmaster here, and he also was on the school board. By the way, I found this story in an article in the New York Times in the 1890 or whatever. Yeah, it's 1890s, I think. So Sam Jones, from the pulpit, said that Walter Ackerman was a low-down, good-for-nothing dog. That's what he called him. And that he made illegal alcohol and he gave it to children. Well, that got back to Walter, and Walter didn't like that much. And so when they met on the street, Walter swung at Sam Jones. And Sam Jones, beat the hell out of him. So the article I found in the New York Times in the 1890s, the byline was, Sam Jones did not turn the other cheek.
Great byline. I think I have a copy of that over in the church at Sam Jones Methodist. Jessica Daves.
Jessica Daves. Somebody that's really overlooked locally of international prominence. She grew up in Cartersville. Her family owned that house, two-story house there at Stone Manor, across from Bartow County Bank. They lived there. Her father was the superintendent of the Cartersville school system.
Correct.
She went through the Cartersville school system. I think she went to Wesleyan or somewhere. But she got into the fashion industry, and she became the editor of Vogue magazine for decades. If you Google her name, that's Daves, you'll see, inevitably, you'll see a photograph of her with Coco Chanel having a cocktail at a street side cafe in Paris. Mm-hmm. She was a major person in the fashion industry.
She was. And unfortunately, unknown here in Bartow County.
She got relatives still live here.
Yes, and there's an article published by her, by one of our members now, too. Lottie Moon.
Lottie Moon came here. She was, later, after she lived here, she was a Baptist missionary in China. Spent her life in China, but she came here and taught at a private academy that was affiliated, I think, with the Baptist Church, and that was located somewhere on Bartow Street. There was a house there behind Presbyterian Church where that academy was. But she left here and went to China, and still today the Baptist Church has a fund in her name where they raise money to send to foreign missionaries.
That's correct. That's correct. Now I'm going to throw you a curve.
A curve.
Mm-hmm. Stan Watee.
Stan Watee. He was a Cherokee Indian who was born and as a young child lived at the village of Pine Log, and he later moved to what's the name of that creek?
Uthakaluga.
Uthakaluga Creek. Right at that time, it was in Cass County, but in 1850, Gordon County and Bartow separated. Mm-hmm. Well, he went to Oklahoma, as did the other Cherokees. He was one of those people who advocated signing the Treaty of 1835 that resulted in removal. He was related to Major Ridge and his son Joseph Ridge, who were both assassinated in punishment for signing that treaty. The only one that was not assassinated for signing that treaty was Stan Watee. And they tried him, they couldn't catch him. I mean, he got away from them. But when the Civil War started, he sided with the Confederates. And he was the only Native American general in the Confederate Army, or I don't think there's one in the Union Army either. And he fought the last battle west of the Mississippi when the war ended. And
the last to surrender.
What else you want to know?
That's enough for him. You went over that. I love it. I love it. Asa Candler.
Asa Candler bought Coca-Cola Company in the formula from John Pemberton, who was a pharmacist in Atlanta. Asa Candler grew up in Villa Rica, Georgia, and he was related to the Young Brothers, who had Young Brothers drugstore. He actually came here and worked for a couple of years. There's a book written about him that quotes him as saying, when he left Cartersville, he said he was leaving Cartersville because it was a one-horse town, mm-hmm. and he went to Atlanta and bought Coca-Cola.
Yeah, he did. He married a local girl.
Yeah.
And many of his family moved here. Mm-hmm. They're buried over in Oak Hill. Nathaniel Harris.
Nathaniel Harris was the governor of Georgia. He was the founder of Georgia Tech. He lived out on Hall Station Road. They had a house called the Oaks, had a plantation called the Oaks, and it was a beautiful two-story house. His family had come here from, I cannot remember where they came here from.
Tennessee, I think.
But with the Alexander family that also lived there in that house. And after the Civil War, he ran for governor. He was instrumental, if not most instrumental, in the creation of Georgia Tech.
Right. So we've had two governors from this county. Yeah, the other one being Joe Frank.
By the
Harris.
way, he wrote Stephen, God, what was his name? Vice President of the Confederacy.
Not Fall.
Alexander Stephens. He wrote a letter before he went to college to Alexander Stephens and asked, could Alexander Stephens help him financially with attending college, because he had heard that Alexander Stephens would do that occasionally. Alexander Stephens responded and funded him to go to college.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did not know that
Yeah.
tidbit.
I may have made it up, but I think it's true.
Well, never let a good fact interfere with a good story. Circuit Rider's Wife.
Okay. Cora Harris wrote that. She lived at out on Calico Valley Road or whatever,
Pleasant.
north of Pine Log, and had a log cabin there. And Circuit Rider's Wife was one of many books that she wrote that was made into, that book was made into a movie. God, what's the name of it?
The name of the movie?
Yeah.
I'd Climb Every
I'd
Mountain.
Climb the Highest Mountain. And it starred this Lundy guy and Susan Hayward.
Robert London,
Something,
and
yeah.
Susan Hayward.
Susan Hayward starred in that. I love that movie.
Yeah, and I have a copy of it.
Yeah.
Robert Benham.
Robert Benham. Robert Benham grew up in Cartersville. His daddy was one of the early superintendents at the George Washington Carver Park, and Robert actually lived in the lodge out there. Robert, as a young man, you may not know this, was on a competitive ski team where he would, these guys would do a pyramid, and he would be the guy at the top because he was the smallest. He went to Tuskegee Institute. He graduated. He was one of the first African American students to attend the University of Georgia Law School. He graduated. There's a picture of him hanging in the foyer at the law school today. He became he was appointed by Joe Frank Harris, the governor, to be on the Court of Appeals in the mid 80s, and then ran for election, was the first African American elected statewide ever. Then he went on the Supreme Court and ran 4 or 5 more statewide campaigns, won every one of them, and recently retired.
Great American, great Bartow County. Rudy York.
Rudy York grew up in Atco, Georgia, and Rudy York became a national National League baseball player. Still has some records. He started his baseball career playing for the Atco baseball team. They used to have competitive teams for all these textile mills, and so he, I think he has the most home runs in the month of August, still.
And I think they call themselves Twisters, Atco Twisters.
And after he was in baseball, he was a house painter here in Cartersville.
Yep, after retired. Rebecca Felton, quickly about her.
Yeah, Rebecca Felton, first senator, female senator of the United States. Her husband, William Felton, was a Methodist minister, but also a politician. She was a syndicated writer. She wrote for articles for the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. She published a book that I've got a copy of about her experiences in the 1840s. She actually rode the train from Marietta till it stopped in Bartow County, and then they got on a stagecoach and came to Cartersville because they didn't complete the railroad until 1850. So she visited down at the Cooper's Iron Works, and she went down there. But she was a nationally recognized political writer. She hated John B. Gordon, who was governor, general in the Civil War, then later governor, then later senator, and she wrote some scathing articles about John B. Gordon. I know that particular because my middle name's Gordon because I'm related to him.
What other name did Charles Smith go by?
Bill Arp.
And who was he?
Bill Arp was a nationally syndicated writer. He wrote for the Journal. He wrote several books. There's a town in Texas named Bill Arp. He was nationally syndicated. He wrote in a dialect. It's almost difficult to read because he used a country dialect in everything he wrote. I've got several of his books, but one of them is called The Uncivil War. And he was the mayor of Rome. He was a captain during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he moved here to Bartow County. He lived out on 411 house out there that the Orkin people now own. That house has been torn down. But then later he moved to a two-story house here in Cartersville. It was on Irwin Street. But he was in his day, he was recognized all over the country for his writing.
Great humorist, even recognized by Mark Twain.
Yeah.
Decidedly a Northern dancer.
Both Kentucky Derby winners that were trained at some time, not all the time, at Old Mill Farm down here on Old Mill Road. And they were trained by Horatio Luro, who married into the Weinman family. He was from Argentina, and he's in the National Hall of Fame of thoroughbred horse trainers.
Yeah, people would be surprised to know that we've had Kentucky Derby winners here. Interesting one here. What was special or whatever about Van Wert Railroad, Cartersville Van Wert?
After the Civil War, there were bonds issued by the state of Georgia at the request of a group of people in Cartersville that consisted of Mark Cooper, God, I can't remember, about 8 or 9 of them formed a corporation. And they wanted to build a railroad from Cartersville to Van Wert. Now, Rockmart then did not exist. Van Wert did. Now Rockmart exists and Van Wert does not. By the way, Sam Jones's first church was the Methodist Church in Van Wert, Georgia. But they started constructing that railroad in the 1870s, and they got from the junction down here on Irwin Street all the way to the Etowah River, and then they hired a guy named Hannibal Kendall, Hannibal Kendall, who had the Kendall House in Atlanta. There was a big hotel that the state capitol was actually operating in his hotel before the state capitals were. Well, Mr. Kimball absconded with the money. They ran out of money, and there were bonds from the state. There was a big controversy. There were trials. The governor of Georgia was involved in it. He was Rufus Bullock, the first Republican governor ever. And he absconded and went to New York, and they sent up there and brought him back and tried him in Fulton County for stealing money from the railroad and the state, and he was acquitted. Yeah. But the railroad was eventually finished by other people. It had several different ownerships
and names.
And if it weren't for that railroad, Plant Bowen wouldn't be here, which may be a good or bad thing. But that's what brought Plant Bowen here. Is that road, really? That railroad, and the purpose of going to Van Wert is it could hook up with the railroad that went to Birmingham. So the purpose of it was to ship our mining products to the market in Birmingham, where was becoming the steel and iron center of the world.
Moving from us to them.
Yeah, and that was the purpose of it.
Right. And that's important, I think, for our community to know what that railroad was there for. Couple more here. I think this one's a neat one. It's a story I think you'd enjoy telling. Cecilia Stovall Shellman.
Yeah. She had a brother that went to West Point. Marcus? Doesn't matter. She had a brother that went to West Point, and he was a friend of William Tecumseh Sherman, and she met, when she visited her brother, she met Sherman. Sherman fell in love with her. Sherman asked her to marry him, and she declined, and she came back and married this Mr. Stovall. She had a house named Etowah Cliffs that was
Heights.
Etowah Heights. Yeah, Cliffs was the Styles.
Right.
Yeah, Styles. Yeah, Etowah Heights. And when Sherman came through this area, out 113 in that area, overlooking the river, and Sherman rode up on his horse, and there was a black lady who was in front of the house lamenting that Miss Cecilia sure was going to be upset about them about to burn her house down. And Sherman asked the old black lady, what Miss Cecilia are you referring to? And she said Cecilia Stovall. And so Sherman wrote a message to Cecilia, something to the effect that she had once lamented or told him that it would be cruel to be on the other side of him or something, but that he saved her house. I don't remember the exact wording of it, but he said at the end of it, I do remember the exact wording. He says, "I am but a soldier," and he saved her house from being burned. Unfortunately, lightning struck it in the 1950s and burned it down.
Burned it to the ground. David, thank you for the interview today and taking us back through Bartow County history. The walk through the history was outstanding, and we will be back again with another oral history from EVHS in the near future.